So let me welcome you all. This is our last lecture, right, of the 2022 Summer Institute for Critical Social Inquiry. And I think most of you know who are here. My name is Ann Stoller. I'm its founding director and its present one. And love doing so, given what I see happening among fellows here. It is my very special pleasure to introduce Jay Bernstein this evening. He is the University Distinguished Professor in Philosophy at the New School. And I think it's really easy to say, and this is not a superlative, he was full of superlatives that weren't the case last night. But no, I think it's really easy to say, to agree that he stands as one of the most profoundly thoughtful philosophers speaking to the dire dilemmas of how we inhabit the world today. He's done this for so long and so persistently, and not exactly, as I think of it, always doing the same thing in some other form. It remains bizarre to us, and I know you've now heard this several times, that we were these high school sweethearts 55 years ago. But what was so interesting about it, we were these voracious and insolent readers, imagining ourselves as radical thinkers, as political poets, raised in a small Jewish, bourgeois universe, dissident with about everything we wanted to be. Jay's ethical compass has not really wavered much since that time. It's guided absolutely all of his work. Moral injury, on aesthetics, a master of both Adorno's corpus and, as this year's fellows know too well, luminously so, of Hegel. And if anyone hasn't ever heard his lectures online, which have been there, how many years? 15 years? They are extraordinary. I mean, if you don't get to his seminar, you've got to listen to these lectures that are all over the world. And they are considered the lectures on Hegel. So after having had to be in this horrible place in Long Island, Jay escaped, right, the US. But first, he graduated from Trinity College in 1970, got his PhD in philosophy. Already he was on the way out in Scotland, and he just didn't come back. After 20 years teaching, and I guess I have to say he was a dean, too, horrendous, teaching philosophy at Essex, and finally came back to the US via Vanderbilt. And then, fortunately for us, the New School for Social Research. Jay seems to embrace something that I think so many people kind of strive for and talk about, but they don't do. What it is to live a philosophically informed life, and to think of philosophy, as Pierre Hadot told us, that it is a way of life, right? It's not just an academic discipline. The acknowledgement with a humility rare among those endowed with such gifts. The philosophical problems that seem to draw him are what Ian Hacking calls, not with reference to Jay, those created when the space of possibilities in which we organize our thoughts has mutated, when it doesn't quite work anymore, and how to not see that as a mutilation, but as a mutation to move somewhere else in a different kind of way. His recent book, Torture and Dignity, is, epitomizes it, revamps how we think about morality, challenges the history of moral philosophy through a Hegelian reading of torture and rape that examine the fragile beings we are, the depth of damage such injuries perform on us as fully recognizable human beings. It's really from this perspective he insists on I don't know how often he says it, but to me it stands out, on the radical dependency in which we live and thrive, and attributing that to Hegel more than to himself. Let me end on his own definition of philosophy. It's really beautiful. He says, philosophy for me means interrogating the foundations of our life together, how we make sense of the world, and how we fail. Failure is really crucial to J. Bernstein. As he says, philosophy starts with failure. Philosophy profiles the human as upright and as failing, as knowing and as blinded, as world-making and as suffering, as flourishing and as dying, and how these competing images are bound together in our morals, politics, art, and ordinary life, unquote. So please join me in welcoming J. Bernstein, who'll be talking to us this evening about the death of nature, critical theory in the age of the Anthropocene. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I'll let the tortoise move for a moment. I knew you couldn't resist that. I couldn't resist it. So this is the first time, this is a test drive. I've never given this talk before. So I am really interested to hear your response. It does run for about an hour, so you are warned, but there'll be things to look at least words, if not my friendly tortoise. Let me begin. The Dialectic of Enlightenment opens with these sentences. Enlightenment has always aimed at liberating human beings from fear and installing them as masters. Yet the wholly enlightened earth is radiant with triumphant calamity. Written in 1944, Horkheimer and Adorno's proposition that enlightenment had become calamity could be taken as literal. Today, triumphant calamity, I think, is literal once more. Human-induced climate change has led from the civilization-supporting ecological harmonies of the Holocene to the growing devastations. The floods, droughts, heat waves, fires, storms, ocean acidification, increasing species extinction, ecocide-produced ecological collapse of what is called the Anthropocene. The global environmental tragedy is most centrally an ethical failure, not a technological failure, not an economic failure, but an ethical failure, and one that implicates our institutions, our moral and political theories, and ultimately ourselves considered as moral agents. Our institutions, our moral theories, our political moralities, even ourselves as moral agents, have jointly collaborated in a state of affairs in which doing what we are overwhelmingly obligated to do seems remote, difficult, unavailable, without urgency, without an anchor in our shared institutional lives. My phrasing for this is often to say, self-interest has done nothing for us. We do not act out of self-interest. We have overwhelming self-interest to do the right thing, and we don't. And the kinds of moral and political philosophies now extant, for the most part, collude with this state of affairs, not resist it. They are ill-designed to address any of the fundamental questions raised by anthropogenically caused climate change. Obvious question, does classical critical theory offer an alternative? Well, what is it? Adorno's critical theory, Thesis 1. The history and current disposition of human domination, whereby some are coerced to manually work on nature and produce wealth, while a small minority of others mentally govern those efforts from afar and reap the preponderance of benefits, is utterly entangled with human separation from and consequent domination over the natural world. The unfreedom, oppression, and exploitation of some for the sake of others is a component in a wider, historically conditioned set of practices of dominating, exploiting, and degrading living nature. So Adorno doesn't start with the domination of man over man. He starts with the attempt to dominate nature and sees that effort as generating human domination. Thesis 2. The history of domination is significantly determined by the history of reason, in which the diverse, inventive, and responsive practices of human comprehension of self and world are increasingly eviscerated until just one remains. Instrumental reason becomes hegemonic over all other modes of knowing and rationality. What that means is knowing becomes natural science, practice becomes technology, and economics, as capital's subsumption of use value, things answering to need, under exchange value. Adorno sometimes, so all those are what the dominance of instrumental reason means. Adorno sometimes explicates the hegemony of instrumental reason as conceptual knowing overtaking and driving out mimetic understanding. And he sometimes calls it identity thinking, whereby abstract conceptual unification, subsuming the many under the one, reconstitutes reality in the abstract language of deductive reason and mathematical physics. The physiognomy of modernity is thus constituted by how the hegemony of instrumental reason holds in place and rationally justifies the continuing practices of petrifying domination of nature within affective bodily life and without living nature, to the point at which it appears as if life does not live. That's actually the motto that begins Minima Moralia. Life does not live. This was a metaphor of domination and reification for Adorno, but it has become the actuality of the destruction of Holocene nature by fossil fuel capitalism. Contemporary critical theory, Habermas, Honneth, Fraser, Forst, Yegi, has failed to fully engage with the systematic exploitation and mortification of living nature at the level of Adorno's original proposal. None of them has said life does not live. The argument of this lecture is that the tradition of ecofeminism significantly converges and overlaps with the argumentation of Adorno's critical theory, and in one vital aspect offers a necessary development. In its convergence An extension of Adorno's critical theory, ecofeminism provides a more compelling account of our present than does official critical theory. So my proposal is this: ecofeminism is the critical theory of and for our present. A modest hypothesis. Okay, this is what I'm going to be talking about. There are three aspects to this story. First, a genealogical aspect, a history, from organism to mechanism on the coming to be of instrumental reason, an Anthropocene nature, where I compare Adorno and Carolyn Merchant, the interpretation of instrumental reason and the operation of hierarchical dualisms, where I compare Adorno's philosophy to that of Val Plumwood, and finally, the separation of male production from female reproduction, the continuing violence of primitive accumulation, which I think is the social theory and structural analysis of our world that we need, in which Mariah Mies and Ariel Soleil are the ecofeminists I use. The tripartite structure of thinking of ecofeminism in terms of history, rationality, and social theory, I owe to Alice Crary. So this is a part of a collaborative work of Alice and I. She takes no credit for the Adorno, although she knows him better than I do. Let me begin. As my students know, I often say, after 5 or 10 or 20 minutes, let's begin. Beginning is so hard. The new mechanical order and its associated values of power and control mandate the death of nature. So the very idea of death of nature, that phrase, is from Carolyn Merchant's great book. Francis Bacon's program for a new science of nature that would establish man as the master of nature anchors, page 1 of Horkheimer and Adorno's conception of the project of rationalized modernity. The happy match between human understanding and the nature of things that he, Bacon, envisaged is a patriarchal one. The first page of Adorno and Horkheimer's book is about patriarchy. The mind-conquering superstition is to rule over disenchanted nature. Knowledge, which is power, knows no limits, either in its enslavement of creation or in its deference to worldly masters. Technology is the essence of knowledge, long before Heidegger. It aims to produce neither concepts nor images, nor the joy of understanding, but method, exploitation of the labor of others, capital. Adorno and Horkheimer frame their account of the project of the mastery of nature as the leading edge of the project of capitalist domination under the guise of a happy match between mind and nature, being patriarchal. That is, like the happy match between a man and a woman. They are a perfectly complementary couple in which the male of reason partner has sovereign authority over the female nature partner. What happens to woman and nature in modernity will be aligned because the stance orienting scientific practice and social order is a modern reconstruction and radicalization of patriarchal domination. The rule over nature women allows what is irrational in the partner to be disenchanted and rationalized. Disenchantment succeeds to the extent that man has power and control over woman nature, and control is expressed through technological mastery. Knowledge is only actual when it is causal and testable, and knowledge is causal and testable, scientific and rational, only if it is subject to technological intervention. Hence, scientific knowledge is actual only as technology, entailing that technology is the essence of knowledge. Knowledge is technologically exploitable in social practices only to the extent that it enables the man of reason to harness the labor of others in producing wealth, value, capital. What human beings seek to learn from nature is how to use it to dominate wholly both it and human beings. Nothing else counts. The intelligibility of knowledge, what scientific knowledge is, cannot be separated from its technological exploitation, and its technological exploitation cannot be separated from its utility for wealth creation. But wealth creation requires the hierarchical ordering of human bodies for the sake of the technological exploitation of nature. That's just the first 2 pages of the book. It's exhausting. We're already exhausted, and they've just begun. That's the setup. That's the setup. It's an extraordinary book. But one last thought. While the disenchantment requirement is fulfilled methodologically through technological control, it is fulfilled ontologically through denying there is anything outside the possibility of technological control which rationally could resist it. This thesis is introduced thus: the disenchantment of the world means the extirpation of animism. Animism, the belief that everything is ensouled, is intolerable because if each thing is besouled, indeed, if each thing is simply alive, then it has a life of its own, a being for itself, its irreducibly particular life, which therefore, in principle, is not for another. Each living thing evinces having a good of its own. In that respect, each living thing matters to it in a way that is not for us. That, for modern science and technology, is intolerable. Scientific reason cannot be without a limitation only if no object, it cannot be without limitation only if no object has a good of its own. Animism has endowed things with souls. Industrialism makes all souls into things. Carolyn Merchant's history demonstrates how these ideas were deeper and more pervasive in the culture of early modernity than Adorno's account signals. The constellation connecting order, power, and mechanism, Hobbes and Bacon seek to institute exactly that constellation, began to emerge as a conceptual framework that could provide an account of both the natural and social world. What was required in order for this constellation of order, power, and mechanism to be actualized was the de-animation of nature and society. That is, the death of nature and the mechanization of social order. Merchant argues that it is only when the metaphor of the machine became a unifying and paradigmatic form for understanding nature and society, Hobbes' Leviathan again, could the constellation of order, power, and mechanism be achieved. Merchant's ecofeminist thesis is that modernity only became possible in its repudiation of the organic understanding of social life in the midst of living nature through the transformation and repudiation of the idea of Mother Nature as the source of continuing life. At the center of the traditional pre-modern worldview, not only was nature in a generalized sense seen as female, but also the earth, or geocosm, was universally viewed as a nurturing mother, sensitive, alive, and responsive to human action. For the Greeks, through the Stoics, the living character of the world organism meant that the earth too was pervaded by a force giving life and motion, to the living beings on it. Now that image, she argues, that vitalist animistic imagery functioned as a restraining ethic. It oriented people's action. That's how they conceived of their possibilities. And that ethic had to be undone if industrial capital was to become possible. Hence, under the pressure from an expanding practices of farming and building and mining that deployed increasingly larger and more sophisticated mechanical apparatuses, gears and chains and pulleys and pumps in clocks and in grain mills and sawmills and windmills, nature as woman, as mother, began to be reconceived. From woman nature as order to nature woman as tempestuous disorder, from virgin to witch, from peaceable source to chaos and disaster. The new attitude toward nature woman is effectively manifest in the massive growth of witchcraft trials throughout Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Bacon's conception of scientific method is presented in terms of necessary violation. I should say this paragraph is X-rated. Its violence and imagery is quite astounding and disturbing. For you have to, this is his view of the scientific method, right? He's not telling a story, this is the view of method. For you have to follow and, as it were, hound nature in her wanderings, and you will be able, when you like, to lead and drive her afterward to the same place again. No novelty. Neither ought a man make scruple of entering and penetrating into these holes and corners when the inquisition of truth is his object. Patriarchy and inequality are not accidental to liberal capitalism. They are its condition of possibility. The subordination of women and the exploitation of nature are inextricably bound together. I'll come back to that thought later. Let me turn to the issue of instrumental reason. Once the social imaginary of the machine is in place, its rationalist epistemology can be given categorical authority. The universe is a hierarchical natural order, the principle of identity in which the many are united under the one. Second, this presupposes knowledge and information can be extracted from the natural world without contextual mediation. The assumption that all knowledge of a valid kind is context independent. Third, against the background of atomism and its successors, leads to the hypothesis that problems can be analyzed into parts in a manner making them subject to mathematical manipulation. Adorno traces the development of this structure of rationality to the growing predominance of instrumental reason that considers objects not in their sensuous complexity and individuality, the responsiveness of mimetic thought, but solely through their usefulness, their causally manipulable properties. The compellingness of this rationality, Adorno argues, derives from it being nothing other than the drive to self-preservation turned into a form of rational, practical behavior. So instrumental reason is compelling because the drive to self-preservation is compelling, and this is the means for self-preservation. For this system of reason, therefore, the rigid either-or, true or false, in logic this is called the law of the excluded middle, is directly coordinated with the relationship between life and death. If your equation is false, the bridge will collapse and people will die. So the either-or of logic, which seems like it's written in the heavens, is actually driven from instrumental reason. Logic is instrumental reason lifted. Otherwise, the law of excluded middle is meaningless. Right? Most things are sort of true and mostly false, right? Why would you believe it's either or? Just this, just this. So by the way, I'm saying the law of the excluded middle is contingent, if you're interested. Okay. Adorno puts us all together in a series of aphorisms. I'll give you just 4. In the paper, I have about a dozen. For the Enlightenment, only what can be compressed by unity has the status of an existent or an event. Its ideal is the logically deductive system from which everything follows. Or the multiplicity of forms is reduced to position and arrangement, history to fact, not narrative, things to matter, not living forces. Bourgeois society is ruled by equivalence. It makes dissimilar things comparable by reducing them to abstract quantities, to the demands of mathematical science, or for use values, to the measure of exchange value. It's worth $10, whatever it is. Finally, in it, science, there is no specific representation. Something which is a sacrificial animal cannot be a god. Representation gives way to universal fungibility. An atom is smashed not as a representative, but as a specimen of matter. And the rabbit, suffering torment in the laboratory, is seen not as a representative, a delegate of its kind, but, mistakenly, as a mere exemplar, a specimen. You might think this is an innocent logic, but they argue it's this logic that generated the extermination camps. Hence, in the concentration camps, it was no longer an individual who died, but a specimen. This rationality, it's worth just $10, is also the rationality of extermination. Val Plumwood's critical ecofeminism elaborates this logic by demonstrating how the benign qualitative differences that saturate empirical reality can be subsumed under identity through the establishment of structural dualisms, while providing an account of how the dualist logic functions. Plumwood's critical ecofeminism is exemplary in joining Adornonian critical theory in its charge that underlying the forms of domination, oppression, degradation, and violence perpetuated by capitalist modernity, there is a rationality deficit, a pathology of reason. I really want to stop here for a second, right? We can't liberate ourselves and keep to the same modes of understanding and thinking. To imagine liberation, to imagine equality, to imagine non-domination isn't to imagine redistribution. That's the same logic. You actually need a different rationality altogether. That's the thesis. After presenting the case where the intentional introduction of a new invasive species of fish ends up as a kill-off of a local penguin population, Plumwood argues that what drove this process finally are systems rather than concrete individuals or classes, forms and patterns of thought and organization, systems for ordering our lives, choices and practices, systems of property formation and distribution, systems of rationality, we might say. Rationality, or some ways of practicing it, is the villain and not the hero of this detective story. Reason has been captured by power and made an instrument of oppression. These ratiogenic patterns of thought and organization, monological, rationalist, hypercapitalist, colonizing, and centric. You would have thought all that in yellow was written by Adorno, right? That's Val's work. Plumwood is implicitly claiming that the coming of the Anthropocene is a radiogenetic crime, a crime of the pathology of reason that includes the degradation of the atmosphere, the oceans, the forests, the human food systems and agricultural land, the radiogenetic crises of pollution and of human health, and the holocaust of animal life. Capitalism is not just an economic practice, but a hegemonic form of reason embodied in systems and practices. So if humanism is going to involve humans being above and outside nature, then the actuality of human dependence on and belonging to the natural world must be effectively repudiated. The danger of humanism. For efficient subordination, what is wanted is the structure of separation and subordination, that separation and subordination should appear as if natural. You all kind of know that from Roland Barthes, right? Myth is naturalization. How does that happen? It happens, she argues, by means of dualism. Dualism is the means by which the colonized are appropriated, incorporated into selfhood and the culture of the master, which forms their identity. In setting up this argument in this way, Plumwood adds another twist to hierarchy. Not just identity and difference, reason and nature, one and many, interpreted through the master-slave model. Master and slave is all over her writing, but also through colonizer and colonized. Albert Memmi is a constant reference for her. Plumwood argues that the key exclusions and denials of dependency for dominant conceptions of reason in Western culture include not only the feminine and nature, but all those human orders treated as nature and subject to denied dependency. That is, proletarian others, slave others, racial others, colonial others, third world indigenous others are all extension of the same original reason-nature dualism. Man, woman, patriarchal structure of domination, employing a like logic of justification. What belongs to or is close to nature needs controlling and dominating as nature does. Because sexual difference is essential to all self-conscious cultures, with the power of female fertility always needing to be acknowledged. Once the path of separation and domination over nature is taken, then the association of women with nature becomes rationally necessary. Perhaps we do this by making women's control over their bodies and power of procreation illegal. See the Supreme Court of the United States. What's going on with Roe v. Wade is not an accident. It's actually part of the deep logic of capital domination. The accident was Roe v. Wade. So these are dualisms that govern Western reason from the perspective of ecofeminism, where I'm suggesting that the culture-nature, reason-nature is organized around the male-female relationship, hence the master-slave, mind-body, etc. I can simply note here, because time is short, as a topic for another occasion, or maybe in the Q&A, that Plumwood's critical theory develops a powerful battery of 5 conceptual mechanisms through which dualism operates. So it's not just dualism. Dualism has to use certain conceptual tropes, backgrounding. Of course, there are women in nature, but they're the background for the important stuff. Radical exclusion, it doesn't matter. Incorporation, it's just part of me. Instrumentalism, it's a tool. Homogenization, there are no exceptions. Okay, my last section is going to be on the problem of primitive accumulation. I should note that there is a tradition stemming from the great work of Lise Vogel, of Marxist socialist reproduction theory. It overlaps with this in many ways. I think ecofeminist version of it is simply philosophically richer. But my colleagues, Cinzia Roots and Nancy Fraser, have done interesting work in social reproduction theory. Each time the term nature is used in patriarchal discourse, it is inherently repressive and speaks to the fact that primal schism of productive and reproductive spheres, that's the thought I want to be thinking about. The primal schism of productive and reproductive spheres, which is the root cause of the disorder of men and of the culture of domination in general. This is the deepest stratum of the ecofeminist thesis. Death of nature is on one side. It assumes the dualism of production and reproduction. Ecofeminists contend that the structural and categorical separation of production from reproduction and the subordination of the latter to the former is the deep structural surd of capitalist modernity in three respects. It depends on the separation of the rational human from nature, making the human subject dominant over nature as a mere lifeless object, hence separation, objectification, and subordination, which itself enables the partial reduction of women, colonized subjects, and racialized subjects to being as much parts of nature as of human society, as if carrying the burden of nature within society, while relegating nature to a mere background, a resource. An externality is what economists call it, in relation to the true work of civilization. Ariel Soleil's breakdown. Because of three, liberal capitalism has ignored, because it conceives of nature as an externality. It has simply ignored the emerging pathologies of Holocene nature, ignored the problem of the poisoning of rivers, the polluting of air, the destruction of soils, the deforestation and desertification, the acidification of the oceans, the extinction of the species, the ecocides of vital portions of the biosphere, the warming of the atmosphere through fossil fuel emissions of CO2. The deformations of Holocene nature became so severe beginning in around 1950 that after a short time we departed from Holocene nature. Whenever you hear people talk about the Anthropocene, make sure they talk about Holocene nature. Without the notion of the Holocene, the Anthropocene is empty. The Anthropocene marks the gravesite of Holocene nature, the evolutionary and ecologically hospitable version of the natural world that had begun 11,700 years ago. There could have been no agriculture in the Pleistocene, right? It was a mess. Agriculture, which is the basis of civilization, only became possible 11,700 years ago, when nature suddenly became moderate and moderately stable. And modernity took this to be a limitless resource, a stable environment indefinitely supporting human civilization in its most progressive aspects. That's what we destroyed. That's what ended. For a lucid statement of the relationship between production and reproduction, both historically and under capital, I want to give you, and I'll read it quickly because life is short, an extended passage from Carolyn Merchant's great book, not much read book, on ecological revolutions. So this is a text that tells the story of ecology in America from the time the colonialists came and destroyed the life of the indigenous people to the present. And our argument is, if you track the ecological history of America, compressed into 200 years, is the same as the 2,500-year story of modern civilization. It's an extraordinary book. For humans, she says, reproduction is both biological and social. Biologically, each adult generation must maintain itself, its parents, and its offspring intergenerationally so that life itself may be passed on. Each individual must also reproduce its own energy and that of its offspring intragenerationally on a daily basis through gathering, growing, or preparing food, and conserve it through clothing and shelter. Socially, humans must reproduce future laborers by passing on family and community norms. And they must reproduce and maintain the larger social order through structures of governance and law, such as laws of property, inheritance, and the ethical codes that reinforce behavior. Thus, while production is twofold, oriented towards subsistence use or market exchange, reproduction is fourfold, having both biological and social articulations. Reproduction is the biological and social process through which human beings are born, nurtured, socialized, and governed. Through reproduction, sexual relations are legitimated. Population sizes and family relationships are maintained, and property and inheritance practices are reinforced. In subsistence-oriented economies, production and reproduction are united in the maintenance of local community. Under capitalism, production and reproduction separate into two separate spheres. Ecofeminists and ecofeminist theory contends that capitalist modernity is the first social formation to radically distinguish production from reproduction, and thus to not regard the primary significance of its own form of life as an enduring intergenerational project. We live in a world where children do not count, where tomorrow's children do not count. Wealth creation dominates over and finally dissolves the normative authority of social reproduction, which is how future generations, the children, can be politically forgotten again and again and again daily. Maria Mies argues that ecofeminism interprets the constellation of subordination of nature to reason and the construction of women, slave bodies, racialized bodies, and colonized bodies as nature, as a theoretical reconstruction of Rosa Luxemburg's account of primitive accumulation. Rosa Luxemburg wrote that Marx's model of ongoing accumulation of capital was based on the assumption that capital was a closed system in which only wage laborers and capitalists existed. She wrote that capitalism always, underline the always, needed a non-capitalist milieu and strata for its extension. According to her thesis, these strata were peasants, colonies, and the imperialist system. Without the ongoing exploitation of non-waged workers and of natural resources, and a perpetual extension of markets, capitalism would not be able to continue its process of permanent primitive accumulation. Luxemburg was not a feminist, but her analysis was crucial for us to understand why women as unpaid domestic workers and colonial possessions, as well as nature's resources, have to be exploited for the process of ongoing capital accumulation. This process is necessarily based on violence. And finally, it destroys the subsistence of people in Holocene nature. There are two grounds for considering what continues to occur in the context of capital, a version of what Marx thought was solely an historical, originating primitive accumulation. First, primitive accumulation continues to involve the dispossession of the bulk of humanity from the productive power of nature. Hence, there is a deep analogy between the earlier thefts of lands, the enclosure of the commons, and the forcing of workers into cities and factories, and the continuance of these practices in the periphery, undermining and extinguishing dignified, subsistence-oriented forms of life. But that says too little. Dispossession alone does not comprehend the continuing ruination, degradation, poisoning, and extinction of the living environment. Ecocide. Capital is an ecocidal project. The death of Holocene nature, whose fundamental dynamics have involved the destruction of its capacity for stable practices of reproduction. That is, the production of the Anthropocene is the cancellation of its own material conditions of possibility. Capitalism is literally a self-defeating performance, a performative contradiction, undermining its own conditions, material conditions of possibility, which were Anthropocene nature. This is the minimum signified by the transition from Holocene to Anthropocene as ongoing primitive accumulation. Second, what holds for relations within the closed circuit of production does not hold for exteriorized structures of reproduction. Primitive accumulation is the continuance of direct domination and violence in the midst of its rationalized and sublated market forms. Hence, even apparently peaceful domestication, housewifization, occur under conditions of domination and oppression that are held in place by force and violence. The persistence of rape, marital rape, femicide, dowry murder, sexual slavery, subsistence exchange contracts, as well as those individual and governmental acts that are used to force local indigenous peoples off their traditional lands, both during the colonial epoch and continuing into the present. Ecofeminists contend that certain things must happen and happen soon if life on Earth for future generations is to be tolerable. The end of the use of fossil fuels and the turn to renewable energy sources, an end of industrial agriculture and a turn to sustainable agriculture and forestry, an end to waste, an end to progress, an end to economic growth. What is necessary and urgent now is a praxis of repair, restoration, making amends to non-identity, that's a quote from Negative Dialectics, to the other through subsuming all production within the embrace of sustainable reproduction. Eco-socialism, as this might be called, is not utopian, but if it were to come about, it would be a tragic ethics of mourning the loss of Holocene nature. Only this would now count as a true consciousness of non-identity, as a true reconciliation between identity thinking and non-identity. Nothing would count as socialism now, Merchant argues, unless it would bring human production and reproduction into balance with nature's production and reproduction. Thank you. Hey,
Hi, thank you very much for your great talk. It was really interesting. I want to just reflect on the title, The Death of Nature and the signifier nature, and reflect on how maybe that signifier also kills some more politicized political understandings of the environment, or said differently, how do you engage with the fact that this signifier of nature also forecloses other understandings, more political understandings of the environment and climate change debates in general? Thank you.
So of course, the name of, there's a famous thought, right, that a political term is necessarily essentially contested. That's what it is for a concept to be political. It has to be essentially contested. So no political concept is utterly stable. When Merchant talks about the death of nature, she's talking about, right, a certain notion of nature, namely Earth as a living system, that got vanquished. Now it seems to me, this is the argument, that this conception of nature, the one that's embodied by Holocene nature, remembering now that nature is not nature, what we meant or have meant by nature has been an historical contingency. Holocene nature just began 11,700 years ago, and now it's gone. We thought for centuries, for eons, for thousands of years, we were talking about nature. We were just talking about an historical slice. And that historical slice, however, made possible what we think of as human civilization, which in its historical dynamic is what, 7,000 years old? Nothing, right? So it has a precise historical meaning. It's not meant to foreclose other political possibilities, but in fact to open them up, to make them possible, to realize that we have done that to the Holocene. I don't know if that quite gets at your worry, but that's how I heard it. Great. Questions? Yes, please just use the microphone. Just go there. Just go to the microphone. Yeah, don't even hesitate.
Hi, Professor. Thank you very, very much for your talk. It was amazing. And I would like to ask a follow-up question of Louise's question, but from the theoretical perspective. I was wondering if by relying on Adorno, especially the Dialectic of Enlightenment, don't we accidentally, or maybe that's a positive, I don't know, but by his kind of ambiguous relation of theory and praxis, I'm thinking on the later Adorno and the problem and how he saw like activism and so on. So if it doesn't, how politics and political action, that's what I meant as a follow-up question to Luis. But does Adorno, how does he, in this constellation that you presented us, how does Adorno relates from this, like with this problematic of politics and his relation with theory and praxis? Thank you, Professor.
So Adorno, first of all, two statements. The first is Adorno himself was a radical activist. He gave over 100 radio talks that were designed to change the public. He was intervening in German politics daily. He thought he went back to Germany in order to reshape it after the Holocaust. So he was not opposed to political activity. He was an activist. So that story about him is a fabulation. He had problems with 68. What he did think, and now I want to say the true bit, is he could not conceive of exactly what the political praxis for overcoming liberal capitalism would look like. He thought his job was to keep alive the possibility of that horizon, and he tried to point to places in culture where it was possible. So if you're looking for political guidance to the revolution tomorrow, do not read Adorno. But also don't read Marx. Marx had nothing to say about it either. And in fact, don't read any Marxists. They have nothing to say either. The failure of the Marxist tradition is it has not been able to think politics. It can think structure, it can think domination, it can think critique, but it has not thought about what politics as transformative activity must be like. So what I want to say to your question is that challenge of the nature of the political is exactly where innovation is now necessary. It is now where the tradition is empty. It's not as if, whoa, we've got these great ideas. No, we don't have a conception. This is why, and you may say it's crazy, why do people still read Hannah Arendt? Talk about an old fogey, right? And certainly she wasn't a radical. They read Hannah Arendt because she thought hard about the nature of the political and tried to think about how the political could be productive or creative, how it could be transformative. she thought hard about revolution and civil disobedience and insurrection. That, for her, is the meaning of the political. So we need models now of the political that can think the political in the mode, right, of radical transformation of our relationships to living nature. Okay, a lot more to say about, so yeah. But I think we need to rethink our categories of Friend Valley Bar insurrection, categories of revolution, right, and so on. So sure. And Adorno's not going to be a help there, but I'm saying there's not much in the tradition that is of much help. Great. Please.
Hey, thank you. That was really rich, and I really appreciate trying to harness ecofeminism to our current thought of state of affairs. My question is it possible to do so without the metaphorization of women and maybe with problematizing the figure of the child and the orientation towards the future?
So maybe we have a dialogue about this. I think history has metaphorized women.
Definitely. Me too.
That's what the story of ecofeminism is about. It's how, I was just teaching Simone de Beauvoir. That's what Simone de Beauvoir is arguing, that the work of history has taken women and made them placeholders of nature in society. So the question is not how the theory fails because it metaphorizes women. It's the question is, how can women's lives be lived by escaping metaphorization? That's actually what we're trying to figure out. So I think the issue of demetaphorizing is actually a political project. It can't be, as it were, done directly or immediately. Because we have to both respect the actuality of social reproduction without turning it into a metaphor. Does that kind of get? Oh, okay, good.
Hey, Jay, good to see you. Yeah, thanks for the talk. I mean, I've been, in the class with you a couple of semesters ago, and all I've been thinking about is kind of the interface between culture and nature from an ecofeminist perspective. And I've beat this question to you to death for a long time now. So this is a new iteration of it again in terms of, is the best model that we can have of non-domination a model of non-dominating complementarity, right? Instead of a more equally participating sort of democracy, to use our politics as a metaphor. And what I mean by that, right, is it seems like aside from the dualisms that Plumwood have listed, there is still a sort of self-conscious versus more naturalized desire or a legislative or legislated kind of dualism. I think that's rarefied in the ecofeminist tradition in how they deal with purposefulness or intentionality, right? And they have disagreements about this, right? So Celia, for example, thinks that attributing intentionalities to nature is a form of anthropocentrism. She doesn't like that. But Val Plumwood, on the other hand, thinks attributing purposefulness to nature is the way to see them as, more legitimate right holders. Even merchants' animism, right? I suspect there is a sort of higher anima versus lower one where, right, one is able to self-consciously think through things versus one experiencing the desires as, right, a sort of lower sort of soul, right? So in all of their approaches, right, their approaches, rationalities are different, but they all verify some level of this self-consciousness, this sort of purposefulness that seems to be lacking in purely reproductive systems that simply maintains itself out of inertia. Is that distinction worrisome? And is that is the model of domination we can have, right, the one where the relationship between those two is considered non-dominating or less dominating, right? Is it possible to get rid of this distance or get rid of this distinction? Sorry, that was a very long-winded question.
No, so the question is, look, living things, natural things are all purposive, and we're purposive too, only we do so intentionally. So it looks as if we're doing something like natural things, but only doing it differently. And if we're doing it differently, aren't we then accepting the dualism between the human and the natural? I take it that's a version of the question. And what I want to say, what I've been trying to say to the Hegelians is the right way to think of intentionality is as a version of natural purposiveness. That's what Hegel means when he says self-consciousness is desire as such. So the thought is we stop taking ourselves out of nature by understanding human practices as just a more complex form of what occurs slightly at different ways at different levels of nature. So all of nature, beginning with the single cell, has purposiveness to it, but the single cell's purposiveness is not that of the plant, and the plant's not of the same as the turtle, and the turtle is not the same as the great octopus, right, who are really smart and all that. So what we want to do is complexify these concepts so they are more elaborate versions of how life appears. So to relocate intentionality in life is how I put it. So yeah, I want to say that we're not going to avoid hierarchy and dualism and domination, therefore, unless we reconceive of everything we do as parts of a natural world. That this is the way a certain species of living beings functions in the world, either pathologically or not. But yeah, it's that reconception that's going to be necessary. Which is why I want to say, just as some people have heard me say, I think literally every inch of philosophy needs to be rewritten. That it all has to be under erasure as we understand ourselves as parts of the natural world more radically, and as parts of an historically contingent natural world more radically. So I take nothing of traditional conceptuality as compelling in itself without further ado, and certainly not the distinction between intentionality and natural purpose. Other questions?
So I have a few packed in questions, and yeah, sorry. So one of them is just, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, and I'm thinking with these questions with the Marxist theorist John Bellamy Foster. So you began with like this sort of critique of Bacon, and so I'm curious, is there a way to sort of complicate Bacon's position in this? Because certainly he can be attributed to having kickstarted this mechanistic view of nature, but then on the flip side, we get people like John Evelyn and other conservationists coming out of his thought because, which is a remarkably Hegelian insight, I think, on his part, that not only does he think it's our job to master nature, but on the flip side, we have to obey its laws. So he's sort of, in a Hegelian line of thinking, is kind of attributing an authority to nature that we have to acknowledge. So I'm interested to hear what you think about that. And then my second question/questions is the question of technology and progress. So the Adornian line about technology and instrumental reason, it makes me a little nervous just because it sounds remarkably Heideggerian in the sense that it's wildly concerned with like being an essence of technology. So I'm wondering, does that not effectively cut us off from an ability to give to technology a material analysis such that we can perhaps actually for the first time, and this is the progress part of my question, determine its use value such that we can say, oh, we really have progressed finally, because you end this by saying we need an end to progress, but perhaps it is the case that we've never progressed because use value has been entirely subsumed under exchange. Thanks.
So, first, with any thinker, and it's true, because of his empiricism, right? Bacon thought that the laws of nature were just out there, and we just need to get rid of certain illusions, and we could then discover them and obey them. So he thought that nature's laws were things to be discovered by the overcoming of illusion. And in that, he was acknowledging a certain authority of nature as a different aspect of his thinking. And what I want to say about that is we should be willing, that philosophy should not be a game of heroes and villains, that we need simply a constructive critical practice, that we find thoughts where we are able to make things matter in a powerful way. And if the idea of obeying nature's laws, say the laws of a particular ecological habitat, knowing what its functions are, then yeah, right? We should make use of that thought. Adorno, I want to be clear, so Heidegger thought, right, that modernity was simply a self-assertion of the will and therefore simply an epochal mistake. That's not Adorno's view. Adorno's view, the Dialectic of Enlightenment, is that progress and regress are happening simultaneously and that they're entangled. That Benjaminian thought, right, that every document of civilization is also a document of barbarism. That's where he got it. He got it from Benjamin, right? And he gave it a very elaborate form. And therefore, he's not opposed to progress, nor is he opposed to the thought that, of course, we're going to need humane technologies. The critique was not of technology. The critique was of the thought that technology is the essence of science, and what technology means is what is exploitable for capital reproduction. Right? And this is a constellation that emerged in the 19th century. It's the reason why capitalism is alive. Capital in the 19th century figured out that economic growth could be dynamized through technological growth at the same time. So that science, Habermas writes about this beautifully, right? Science and technology is ideology, understanding how, and this is what socialists have not figured out how to do, by the way. Capitalism has found a way of harnessing technology purely for the sake of wealth production. And what we've not done, we don't know how to do, except in isolated circumstances. I could say more about socialism as constellation, but we haven't figured out how to harness those powers for humane rather than wealth-creating purposes. So of course we're going to need them. The reason why, at least rhetorically, I was so harsh is because, and this is going to be for those of you who are under 50 here, which is most of you, the rest of your lives you're going to be harassed by various forms of geoengineering. That the solution to the problem of climate change can be done through a technological write-off. I'm just reading The Ministry of the Future. If you haven't read it, read it tomorrow. And it begins with just that. India has undergone a terrible heat wave. Millions of people have died. And the Indians say, we're going to shoot stuff into the atmosphere to cool the earth down the way a volcano would for the next couple of years, so at least they won't kill the rest of us. Geoengineering is going to be the constant political argument for the next 50 years. It's going to be kicking around. And therefore, we have to understand what a technological way of thinking. There was an argument in the New York Times this last January, I believe it was, by a leading scientist at Harvard who said, right, of course, get CO2 levels so that it's zero, right? No new emissions. They said, but look, that's not going to deal with climate change because of all that stored up CO2 in the atmosphere. It's going to go on for hundreds of years. I have a solution. I have a solution, he said. Geoengineering's the answer. Elizabeth Colbert's book, White Skies, is a good account of this phase. So yeah, I'm not opposed to technology, but we have to fear technological rationality. Right? Andrew Feenberg has written really well on this. Okay. A last question, yeah?
Thank you very much for the great lecture. So I had a question. It seems like there may be an ethical or normative demand to recover the excluded middle from its exclusion. And I guess I'm just thinking about sort of the way forward. It seems like a lot of the terrain that the crises that we're facing needs to be fought on now is in terms of rethinking our modes of thinking. So it seems fundamentally like an epistemic project. But I was wondering if built into this is also a kind of skepticism about rationality, given that it's been co-opted and degenerated by these social practices. So I was just wondering about sort of what method could be employed for thinking through and recovering some of these lost experiences that have been shrouded in ambiguity as a result of our social practices. So do we need to turn to aesthetics? Do we need to turn to, I mean, I'm thinking about sort of what's best to put us back in contact with the world that we've severed ourselves from through the corruption of rationality. Yeah. Thanks.
So just a footnote, before she was Val Plumwood, Plumwood's a kind of tree, Australian tree, she was Val Rootley, and she was a logician. She was actually a philosophical logician. And she's been thinking hard about the meaning of logic, hence her emphasis on thinking about these structures in terms of the law of excluded middle, right? Her husband, Richard Rootley, who became Richard Sylvan, they both became environmentalist, did tremendously wonderful work in deviant logics. So they were both logicians who turned to environmentalism. So the whole of my life, I've been trying to think about alternative rationalities. That's what really all my work has been. And again, yes, you're right, I've used aesthetics as a way of doing it. That's one sphere of sets of practices. That's why I've been interested not in the idea of beauty, but in how do you make art? How do you make projects that have certain structure? What's the meaning of narrative as opposed to deduction? What's the meaning of mimetic representation as opposed to analytic? But we're now at a different moment, and I am inclined to say now that the best ways forward is by actual practices. So I'm much more interested in how is this organic farmer figuring out how to work his land, and don't we need to benchmark that? How is this city figuring out how to transform itself from dependence on fossil fuels to renewables? What kind of walls does it? So it seems to me now what we need is context-based, practical models, Mill had the famous phrase, experiments in living. But there was something right about that. That what we need is endless experiments in how to build houses, how to farm, how to have cooperative production, and use those and figure out how to benchmark and then transfer them around. Because, and this is my deepest, that if the problem of capital is unitary, then what we want is plural rationality. Hence, I've argued for the last 5-6 years that we need a model of socialism, not as a unity, but as a constellation of a plural sets of practices, each specific to their own domain. And therefore, we need a far more radically experimental understanding of even rationality itself. So rather than asking for the problem of rationality, rather to withdraw from that and ask, how do we deal with this environment here? How do we organize our lives together here? And think about what rationality emerges without, as it were, putting on it prior restrictions. So the argument is for experimentalism and plurality as opening ways of opening up under a governance that we are just plain citizens of the natural world. Right? It's a quote, right, from the Almanac. Okay. Thank you very much.